Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Jean Franco, Professor Emerita of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. The first professor of Latin American literature in England, Franco is the winner of the 1996 Penn Award for lifetime contribution to disseminating Latin American literature in English, and has been recognized by both the Chilean and Venezuelan governments for advancing literary scholarship on Latin American literature in the United States. Franco is the author of An Introduction to Latin American Literature, Plotting Women, Gender and Representation in Mexico, The Decline and Fall of the Lettered City, Latin America in the Cold War, and most recently, Cruel Modernity. Franco participated in panel discussions about her recent book and at the symposium From Silence to Memory, Archives and Human Rights in Guatemala and Beyond on October 23rd and 24th, 2013. The events were organized by the Latin American Studies Program and UO Libraries and co-sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center. Jean, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
What led to your interest in Latin American literature?
What led my interest was actually being thrust into Latin America. I went to Guatemala in very 1950s. Left after the coup of Castillo Armas for Mexico, and then in Mexico I got very interested in literature because I was with a group of people who were performers and did performances of poetry, and so I got very interested. I decided to go back to university and study, which I.
Did you have Spanish when you were there, or did you?
I learned it when I was there. Yeah.
Huh. Early in your career, you played a groundbreaking role in promoting Latin American literature outside of Latin America. Why did you believe that work needed to be done?
Why did I do it? Or, because there was nothing, there were no Latin American literature virtually in England at that time. There was just one or two little outposts, but nobody was very interested in it. And so, I got it on the ground floor, so to speak. I had to build up libraries and so on and so forth. I wrote the introduction to Latin American literature, and so, funnily enough, the Duke of Edinburgh was sent on some royal tour of Latin America and came back saying, "Why isn't anybody studying Latin America in England?"
Huh, you did get in on the ground floor.
Absolutely.
Among your many interests are gender and the experience of women in Latin America. Can you tell us why the experience of women is so important for understanding Latin America?
Well, it's a very sort of sore point, I think, because there's a lot of kind of enormous amount of misogyny traditionally, and so and it was very difficult because like the Latin American literature was very much seen for a while as a kind of male preserve, and women writers were called they were called, they were sort of put aside as something like a sort of lower interest of some kind. So I thought, there's some great writers. I mean, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is one of the greatest writers from Mexico. So I thought it was a bit about time to sort of look at it and see what women tried to do to get into literature, because, they had to sort of contort themselves in many ways. Disguise what they were doing.
How have feminist movements developed and impacted modern Latin American societies?
Well, I think the International Women's Conference in 1975 in Mexico was really the starting point. And from there, they developed quite strong feminist movements in many countries. And I'm closest to people in Mexico, where there's a really very strong women's studies program at the university. There's a great journal called Debate Feminista, which has been running now for, I think, about 25 years too. So, and also, I mean, there are some very big issues, like issues of abortion, issues of women's rights, issues of violence against women, right? Huge, huge problems.
Your more recent work is focused on Latin America during the Cold War and the disturbing problem and practice of cruelty. What inspired you to undertake that project?
Well, the fact that there was a lot of cruelty to begin with, right? particularly during the dictatorships in the 60s and 70s. Also, cruelty, casual cruelty almost, you know, day-to-day cruelty. So I just felt, and a lot of literature deals with that, so I just felt that it was time to sort of air that particular topic.
The newest book is titled Cruel Modernity. How do you define modernity in Latin America?
Well, I think it's associated with the whole process of so-called modernization, right? And the obsessive preoccupation with their backwardness, right, which was like decreed from the Europe and the United States, that they were backwards. So, you know, the idea of becoming modern, becoming contemporaneous with the rest of the world. I mean, for a long time that was a big preoccupation. Not so much now, but certainly in the past.
So why did you frame your investigation of cruelty within modernity? How does those...
Because there's a sort of, in the anxiety to modernize, I think many governments took a kind of path by which instead of sort of bringing the whole population up into the modern, they wanted to sort of either exterminate or do away with those elements of the population that they didn't see as modern. And the classic case was, in fact, Guatemala, where, you know, the ethnically diverse indigenous were seen as being backward, and their native dress and languages were seen as being antithetical to any idea of a modern nation. And for that, I mean, they were massively exterminated at one particular period during the military government.
So the notion was that it would be more cost-effective and efficient to exterminate these people rather than to educate them?
I don't think they put it quite in those words, but in fact, that's what happened. That they tried to forbid native dress, native languages, and so on. They put, during the Civil War, they put indigenous peoples into these model villages where they had no ethnic characteristics whatsoever, right? So there was a very determined effort.
I'm interested in this in particular because it seems that at this now indigeneity is identified as crucial or central to these national identities. So this is very much a kind of this concept of modernization. It was very much in a European mode, right?
Right. Yes. But I mean, yes, I think it was very much the idea during the sort of 60s and the early 70s. That was the notion. I don't think anybody would embrace those ideas now.
Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about the research that you did? How did you do this research for Cruel Modernity?
Mostly in a library reading.
Here or there?
Both here and there, yeah.
So what were the documents that you were looking at?
Well, most of it's published documents, right? Many of them are like the reports of the commissions on clarification of the past, like the Guatemalan, the Peruvians, the Chileans, and so they all produce these documents, a documentation of repression. And those are extremely valuable documents. They're very detailed, and you can learn a lot from them.
So this panel that you're speaking on today is about the Guatemalan Archives. Can you tell us a little bit about the Guatemalan Archives in particular?
Well, the ones that are being studied today are the police archives, but there's also a very important human rights document, which is on the military. I mean, there are two things, the military and the police, right? And it was the military repression in the countryside which exterminated, you know, literally thousands and thousands of indigenous people.
I've always been curious about the strange obsession of repressive regimes in documenting this torture. I mean, the Nazis did it too. What do you make of that? What's that? How do you explain that?
It's a very interesting question. That I'm not sure that I have an answer for it, but it's certainly true that not only that, they give interviews. I mean, there's the most extraordinary extraordinary interviews in Guatemala with torturers who explain their methods. They say, you know, we did this, that, and the other in a very kind of cool manner, as if they're just sort of bureaucrats. And of course, that is the impression they try to give, that they're just bureaucrats who are obeying orders. I mean, they didn't have any say in this themselves. Mm-hmm. So, you know, they're torturing, but they're not responsible for it. That's the idea.
And is there a kind of sense of professional pride in this? That, you know,
yeah, there is.
Huh. So, can you give us a sense of the scope of the cruelty that has marked Latin American modernity?
That's very difficult to say because it depends on the country, but I would say that, you know, the worst places were probably Chile, Argentina, Guatemala, Central America, right? But, I mean, most places have got terrible stories to tell. I think all, possibly Costa Rica is not.
So what are the conditions that give rise to atrocity and torture? What leads human beings and states to undertake this behavior?
Yeah, well, I think the conditions are that they, they see, I think it is this kind of quick step, right? It's only by exterminating or by eliminating this opposition that we're really going to sort of get ahead. And the other thing that we have to sort of mention is the role of US in this, and the School of the Americas, which was a center that taught people to repress. And they, I mean, I don't know how many, I would say most of the most notorious torturers, the most notorious repressors were taught in the School of the Americas. It's astonishing.
What was the, how did the American government justify that behavior? I mean, I mean, there must have been some logic, right? What was it?
Well, I guess they justified it on the grounds that, you know, these people had to be eliminated. I don't know what justification they could possibly have.
Well, it's related to the Cold War, yes?
Yeah.
So how does the sort of story of anti-communism in America fit in here?
Yeah, well, I'd say that it was a perverted version of the Monroe Doctrine. You know, nobody had to interfere in the Americas. And it was this perverted version of the Monroe Doctrine that sort of led to what they call the war against communism. In the name of the war against communism, in which almost anybody in opposition was a communist, that the exterminations started, and the war. It was a war.
So this cult of efficiency gone wrong, or this is something that the United States is as culpable in your view, as these Latin American governments?
Well, also the view from the United States that there's only one way of becoming modern, right?
Besides repressing dissent and extracting information, what are some of the other goals that torture seeks to achieve?
The other goals of torture?
Yeah. Why? I mean, you've spoken about a couple, but
yeah. Well, ostensibly it's to get information, but I think there are many cases where that, I mean, either the information was already held by the people who were torturing. So what is it? It's to intimidate as much as possible, to intimidate and to eventually exterminate the opposition.
Bald show of power.
Yeah, there was a case in Chile of the mother who was asked to look at the body of her tortured son. And she sort of said she couldn't understand, you know, the kind of fury of the torturers against this particular body. I mean, it went far beyond any kind of idea of just killing a person.
Do you have any idea why these techniques could become so elaborate and so extensive? I mean, the role of cannibalism, for example, is so bizarre.
I know, that's completely, it's almost incredible, but yeah.
Do you have any idea why that's a part of this, that these techniques become so elaborate and so Baroque in their...
Well, it got out of hand, I think, you know, really. Because I think the army in Guatemala, where there was this cannibalism, right, there was sort of training of troops in cruel actions before they went into it. For instance, they practiced rape on prostitutes, I mean, that kind of thing. There was a rehearsal. And so, you know, once they got into these situations, I think they felt there was absolutely no limit.
And in fact, that there was an incentive to be limitless.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a competition between different military companies who
right,
could be the most grotesque.
Even personnel, right? This is how I get ahead.
Crazy, crazy. Why have women and indigenous people disproportionately been the victims of atrocity and torture?
It's a very good question, that, but I'm not sure that I know the answer. But I mean, well, I think with the indigenous people, there was this kind of, in Guatemala, there was this program for modernization, and they were not modern. I think as far as the women were concerned, I mean, it's like an extension of the extreme misogyny, which I think characterizes many societies. And it was then, you know, practiced on women.
I know I'm a scholar of British modernism, and this puts me in mind of Virginia Woolf's polemic Three Guineas, where which is written in 1937, I think, and she's very explicit there in making a direct connection between patriarchy in Britain and fascism in Europe. And
I should read that then.
And she sees that fascism and this kind of authoritarian repressive regime is actually a kind of extension of patriarchy, of misogyny.
Right. No, that's absolutely true, I think.
How do the perpetrators of atrocity and torture justify their cruelty?
Well, they have this very bureaucratic language for justifying it. We're obeying orders, or well, usually we're obeying orders. That's the idea. I mean, the Eichmann defense comes to the fore here. This was the model when they were confessing stuff. It was the Eichmann defense that I was obeying orders. I wasn't really kind of responsible for what I was doing, right?
Has your research demonstrated that there was actual, I mean, that they used Nazism as a kind of model?
They did, certainly, quite overtly. In Argentina, it was quite clear that they did. I mean, they used the same language.
Very interesting. To what degree have the perpetrators of all this torture faced justice?
Not enough. Not enough. They have been put on trial, and they've been given long life sentences, say in Argentina they have, in Chile also. In many places they've been brought to some kind of justice. But I mean, the most glaring case recently was Rios Montt, who was president of Guatemala during the worst of the atrocities, who was put on trial, but then the trial has been suspended, so it looks as though he may just get off, right?
Do you have any idea of the numbers of men who were involved in
I wish I did, but I don't. No, I'm not tried to make...
Is it hundreds and thousands?
Oh, it must have been hundreds, yeah.
And is this practice largely complete? Is it over now?
I hope it's over now,
as
right?
far as we know, that it's no longer being practiced. It's not being state sanctioned in any Latin American countries.
But I think that now there's another kind of atrocity going on, which is the atrocity, this is committed by the drug traffic and drug traffickers, which is like an extension of these other atrocities. And which I think came, I mean, certainly in the case of Mexico, I think there's a line from Colombia where the drug trafficking, got its start in the most violent way. And they go through these channels through Central America into Mexico. And with it goes the cruel treatment to people who either, try to cheat them or whatever.
So they've learned certain lessons from the state-sponsored torture?
Certainly in Mexico, I mean, the case of beheadings, I mean, why would people want to behead their opponents. And those beheading was very much something that was practiced in Colombia during, not just by drug people, but also by the paramilitary in Colombia.
So this sort of spectacular demonstration of
Yeah.
cruelty. I know one of the aspects of the most recent book is precisely that you're not just interested in cruelty in the context of state-sponsored institutional cruelty, but also revolutionary cruelty, and now in this case, criminal cruelty.
Yeah.
Has this research, where has this research left you in terms of the human condition, human beings? I mean, do you think that this is something that's particular to modernity, or particular to men, or is this, I mean, are human beings just
bad?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, I read Steven Pinker on the way, and he's very optimistic about the human condition. He thinks things are getting better, and I don't think so at all. And I mean, it seems to me that there's a very kind of short fuse in the human brain, and that very rapidly you can sort of become the perpetrator of cruelty. I mean, it's not something that's exceptional. And I think although it's mostly practiced by men, or was, I think in the case of, for instance, the Sendero Luminoso, where women were also involved, that it depends on the situation. Usually women are not put in that particular position. They're not in the army, or not usually in the army anyway. But where they have been, or where they've been exposed to this, they can also commit violent acts. So it's not just a masculine thing at all. Although I think extreme masculinity has a role in it. I mean, when you come to think of it, the training of the male into sort of violent pursuits.
You don't think you would go so far as saying that testosterone is the reason, but it plays a role?
Well, it could play a role, but I mean, I don't think it's the only.
So, how effective have the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions been in addressing this cultural trauma?
I think they've done an extraordinary job, quite frankly. I mean, really, because they've been so painstaking, and they've interviewed absolutely thousands and thousands of witnesses. They've really made a great effort to get something called the truth right out of this. So I think they've done an extremely good job.
Do you believe that the time of terror in Latin America is over?
I hope so. I really hope so, but you can never trust anything. And I think the biggest problem at the moment is the drug trafficking, and until something is done about that, I don't think that the atrocity will disappear.
Do you think that, I mean, the changes that have been happening in Latin America, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions obviously are exemplary of, on the one hand, there's this rise in the power of Latin American nations, the stability of their governments, the importance of indigenous movements and leaders, the assertion of Latin American identity and Latin American political influence across the world. And at the same time, this problem of drug trafficking and criminality is rampant. Yeah. And these, I mean, on the one hand, you look at these nations, you think, this is incredible, the transformation. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, I mean, that they look at their history and are confronting it in this incredibly impressive way. And at the same time, this terrible scourge of drug crime. Have you thought about how to solve that problem? It's not really a fair question, but I can't resist asking.
I know. I've thought about it, but it's very, very difficult to deal with because, well, look, take the case of Mexico, for instance, where the what's it called, the treaty with the U.S., NAFTA treaty. Actually, throughout one of the effects was throwing out people who had their own little agricultural plots or whatever, really making them kind of out of work and out of a living.
Mm-hmm.
So it created a whole pool of people with who were starving, presumably, and wasn't easy. It wasn't difficult for the for drug traffickers to recruit them to help with the drug trade, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you get people being drawn into this out of some sort of desperation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have only a couple of minutes left, but I have to ask you this question. To say that you've had a lengthy and productive academic career would be an understatement. For 50 years, you've been one of the world's leading scholars of Latin American literature and culture. You've been an emerita professor for 10 years, yet you've just published another groundbreaking book. How do you do it?
How do I do it?
Yeah, well, I mean,
it must be
so many people would just stop. They would, they would retire and go to the Riviera. And
I know, but what would you do on the Riviera? I mean, my life's been reading, and I love reading, and I'll go on reading, right?
But it's not just reading.
No.
You're a writer and
yeah. Well, that's what keeps me alive, I think.
It's just inspiring
Yeah.
to continue to do it. How has research and writing shaped your life?
Oh, considerably, I would say.
You've just implied that it's kept you alive. Is that?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say so. I mean, I just can't imagine myself sitting on a rocking chair and dozing in front of the television set or something.
So you still enjoy traveling around the world
Yeah.
and doing, and you do the research, but you also come to places like the University of Oregon to be on these panels.
Yeah.
I'm sure that you encounter a lot of young scholars coming up in,
Right.
in the field. I know that they're screening Gabriela Martinez's documentary this evening. Have you seen the documentary?
Not yet. I'm hoping to see it today.
That must be inspiring for
It
you.
is. It is.
I know that there are many people in your field who look to you as a real inspiration. And do you feel that as part of your, what inspires you?
Well, I mean, it's very important to me to keep in touch with young people. Because, they're the ones who are curious or, probably finding new directions that I haven't thought of. So it's wonderful to talk to them.
Jean, I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. Thank you so much for taking
thank
the time
you.
today to talk to us.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Jean Franco, Professor Emerita of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. Franco participated in panel discussions about her recent book, Cruel Modernity, and at the Symposium From Silence to Memory, Archives and Human Rights in Guatemala and Beyond on October 23rd and 24th, 2013. The events were organized by the Latin American Studies Program and UO Libraries and co-sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center. Thank you for watching.